Chapter 34 is about the biosphere, and the biosphere is all of the ecosystems, and so there's about 5 terms that are important first of all, and the first one is organism, so we know what that is. That's an individual. And then the second one is population. So population is all the members of a species in a given location. And the third one is community. So community is all of the populations living close enough together to interact. So we have these different species interacting with each other. And then the fourth one is the ecosystem. So the ecosystem is the community plus the abiotic factors. So the abiotic factors are the nutrients, water, and energy. And these, the population or community is interacting with these. And finally we have the biosphere, and that's the sum of all the ecosystems on the earth. Biomes are broad areas with characteristic temperature and precipitation. So the earth is round, and so because the earth is round, the sunlight hitting it differs depending on where you are on the surface. If you're right at the equator, there's direct sunlight, but if you're towards the poles, the sunlight is indirect, and so at the equator the intensity of the light is greater than it is at the poles or near the poles because of the angle of the incident light in relation to the surface, because it's curved. So here we have this in more detail. So at the equator, that's 0 degrees. The direction of the light influences the movement of the air currents. So in direct sunlight at the equator, air is ascending, and as it ascends it releases moisture, because as it ascends it cools down and loses heat, it loses water holding capacity, so it rains a lot at the equator. And then as the air cools, it moves outwards from the equator, and then when it reaches about 30 degrees north or south, the air mass begins to fall. And descending air absorbs moisture, because as it descends it heats up, and as it heats up it has more capacity to hold water. And so at 30 degrees north and south, the ground dries up because moisture is transferred from the ground to the air. And so you tend to get dry conditions at 30 degrees north and south. Then the air rises again, and it rises around 60 degrees north and south, and again, because it's rising, it loses that water holding capacity and it rains a lot. So you have different areas, different zones of temperature and rainfall, and so you get these different biomes at these different latitudes. Also not shown here, but at the poles, the air is falling again, and it's very dry at the poles because of that. So the biomes influence the distribution of the communities because they have these different patterns of temperature and precipitation. There's 7 major terrestrial biomes. So these are ranged roughly from the equator, north and south of the equator. And the first one is the tropical forest. It's at the equator, and it's characterized by being hot and humid and having lush vegetation and a lot of biodiversity. Then going further north and south, you have savanna. This is warm, not as hot as the forest, tropical forest, but warm, less moist, and has a lot of grass but few trees. Then we have the further north, we have the desert, very dry, hot, and cacti and other succulent plants live there because of the very dry conditions and not much rainfall. Then further north, you have the temperate grasslands and temperate forests. The grasslands are dry and have grass and shrubs. The forests are somewhat moister and have trees, but their temperature is moderate. Then further north, about 60 degrees north and south, you have the coniferous forest, and this is more moist, but it's cold and the trees are larger. And then finally we have the tundra, this being further north than the coniferous forest, and this is in areas like Russia and places very far north. Dry, cold, and the vegetation is small moss and other shrubs. Last, in chapter 34, we have the water cycle, and this consists of evaporation, precipitation, and transpiration. So we're all familiar with the first two, evaporation and precipitation. Evaporation is just water getting heated up and forming vapor and going back into the atmosphere. Precipitation is rain. But transpiration is the evaporative cooling from leaves. So trees will send water out through the leaves, and this is important in forest ecosystems or forest biomes, because a lot of the precipitation comes from transpiration, and when forests are clear cut, they tend to become very dry like deserts, at least temporarily, until the new trees can grow back, because transpiration contributes quite a bit to the water cycle in that kind of environment. Okay, moving on to chapter 37 now. Chapter 37 is all about community ecology, the interactions between different species in a community. And there's a number of these types of interactions, and they're listed here. And these are the two species interacting, 1 and 2, and examples. So first we have competition. So this is where two species are competing for the same resource, such as squirrels and bears competing for nuts and things like that to eat. And then mutualism is where the two species help each other. So an example of that would be plants and the mycorrhizae. These are the root fungi that are helped by the plant, and in turn they help the plant assimilate nutrients. Next is predation. This is basically one species eating another species. So owl and rodent, the owl eating rodents. Herbivory is basically insects eating plants. So caterpillar eating a leaf would be an example of herbivory. And then parasites and pathogens. This helps the pathogen but harms the host. So an example would be salmonella in a human. Okay, next in chapter 37, we have the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle, you have the reservoir of CO2 gas in the atmosphere. That is, part of it is absorbed by the photosynthesis by plants and algae. And when consumers eat those plants and algae, the carbohydrates that is made in photosynthesis is then oxidized by aerobic or cellular respiration, and that returns CO2 to the atmosphere. Also, when the plants and the consumers die and their bodies decompose, the decomposers, that is the bacteria and fungi, then also do cellular respiration, which again releases more CO2 into the atmosphere. And so there's a large reservoir of CO2 in the atmosphere. And also when the plants and algae, when deposits of these are preserved as fossil fuels, when that is burnt, then that again contributes CO2 to the atmosphere. Next topic is the food chain, or trophic levels. So the food chain begins with the producers, the plants and algae that are doing photosynthesis, and those of course are consumed by primary consumers, which could be insects or other things, and then those are consumed by secondary consumers. I'm just giving some examples here. For example, a mouse might eat an insect that had in turn eaten the plants. And so these arrows represent consuming at different levels. So the arrow points to the consumer. Then you have the tertiary consumers that are eating the secondary consumers, and the quaternary consumers eating the tertiary consumers. As you go up in the food chain, the numbers of individuals at each level go down because there's a limit to how much energy can be transferred up the food chain. As we saw earlier, the second law of thermodynamics says that at each stage there's losses due to heat, and so as you go up the chain, there's fewer and fewer, smaller and smaller population. When you get towards the top of the food chain, certain members of the top levels are known as keystone species. And these are species that, if they were absent, would cause the numbers of the lower levels to grow and reproduce out of control. And so they're very important in maintaining the whole ecosystem, and if they disappear, then the whole ecosystem collapses, much like an arch would collapse if a keystone, the stone at the top of the arch, if that's removed, the whole arch collapses. And another important thing about the trophic levels and food chain is the detritivores and decomposers, which are the fungi and bacteria, which break down the dead bodies of all of these levels and return those nutrients to the environment where they're recycled. And they also, of course, contribute to the carbon cycle by doing cellular respiration, which contributes to the CO2 in the atmosphere. And now in chapter 38, the last chapter, is on conservation biology. And it begins with the subject of biodiversity. So what are the benefits of biodiversity, or a great diversity of organisms. First, it's called ecosystem services. So these are things like pollination of crops, water purification by plants, and oxygen from plants. So these would be examples of ecosystem services. And another is raw materials. So a diverse environment provides many building materials, foodstuffs, so the raw materials for foods, and textiles, the fibers used to make clothing and other fabrics, and also bioactive chemicals. So these are things like drugs, such as antibiotics and other antimicrobials, and perhaps other things that we haven't yet discovered. So there's a lot of diversity in the environment that hasn't been utilized by humans or discovered by humans yet, and so there may be many bioactive chemicals out there that we still haven't discovered. But those would be requiring that the biodiversity is maintained, or the organisms that produce those may disappear. Okay, finally in chapter 38 we have a couple of concepts here, the invasive species and endemic species. So invasive species are species that are introduced by accident or intentionally that destroy ecosystems. They can displace endemic species. These are species that live in one area and nowhere else. And the other concept is the greenhouse effect and climate change. So human burning of fossil fuels adds about 30 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere each year. So year in, year out, there's an additional 30 billion tons being added by fossil fuel burning. And that CO2 doesn't go away. It stays and accumulates in the atmosphere because plants can only use a very small portion of that, maybe 1% or less. The rest just stays there and stays there for thousands of years because it's fairly inert. It does a small amount, gets gradually absorbed by carbonaceous rock, but it's a very slow process. So there's much more being added to the atmosphere than is being mineralized or removed by photosynthesis. And this amount is way in excess of any natural process. For example, volcanoes produce only about 2% of this figure, so much less than what we humans are putting into the atmosphere. And there's also, so why is CO2 a bad thing to be adding at such an amount to the atmosphere? And it's because CO2 is very good at trapping heat. It acts as a blanket, and we actually need some greenhouse effect. We need a certain amount of greenhouse effect to keep the earth warm. And without any greenhouse effect, the temperature of the earth would be much too cold for life. It'd be about the temperature of your freezer at home. So we need some CO2 and greenhouse effect, but too much CO2 is not good because there's a very strong correlation between CO2 level as evidence from ice core data and temperature data. So the temperature of seawater can be measured by oxygen isotopes that are deposited in seashells. And if you take a core from the sea bottom, it contains these seashells, these tiny shells called foraminifera, and within those shells you can measure the oxygen isotopes, and this the oxygen isotopes, the ratios of the different isotopes are an indication of the temperature of the water. and what scientists find is that the amount of CO2 level and the levels and the temperature are directly proportional. So the more CO2 level in the atmosphere, as measured in ice core data, the higher the temperature. So ice cores, if you go to Greenland or to Antarctica and take a core of ice, the ice contains dissolved gases that were present in the atmosphere when the ice formed. And so it's a record of the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And they correlate very well with the temperature from the oxygen isotope data. So this means that the more CO2 you add to the atmosphere, the hotter it gets, and vice versa. So if we can find a way to either stop burning fossil fuels or a way to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, the excess, then we may be able to get back to more manageable temperatures.